Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Tennessee. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing to which places and at what times of day or night these documented stories reach. The year was 1919. The Great War had just ended, and soldiers were returning home to America's heartland. But in the remote hills of eastern Tennessee, in the shadow of the Great Smoky Mountains, a different kind of darkness was taking root. This is the story of Louise Whitaker, a name that appears in no official historical record, yet whose fate haunted Morgan County for generations. County records from that time are incomplete. What little documentation exists was largely kept by the Presbyterian Church in the town of Sunbrite, a small railway stop along the Cincinnati Southern line. It was there that Louise Whitaker, a 28-year-old woman who had moved from Knoxville after the death of her husband in the war, took up residence in a modest two-story house at the edge of town. She arrived in February of 1919, according to tax records later discovered in a courthouse basement in 1961. The winter of 1919 was particularly harsh in Tennessee. Coal was scarce, and many residents of Morgan County kept to themselves, doors locked against both the cold and the influenza that had ravaged the country the previous year. Louise Whitaker, by all accounts, was no different. She was described in a local newspaper announcement as a widow of respectable standing seeking employment as a secretary or bookkeeper. She had training, something unusual for women in that part of Tennessee at that time. What happened in the months between February and September of 1919 exists now only in fragments, church records, personal correspondence that surfaced decades later, and the carefully documented notes of Sheriff Robert Milligan, whose investigation would never reach a conclusion. The first indication that something was amiss came on April 17, 1919. Louise Whitaker visited Dr. Harold Jenkins, the town's only physician. His records, discovered in 1957 when his office was being renovated, note that Mrs. Whitaker complained of persistent feelings of being watched and unusual sounds in the upper floor of her residence. Dr. Jenkins prescribed a mild sedative and attributed her concerns to grief over her husband's death. According to a nursing assistant who worked with Dr. Jenkins, Louise appeared uncommonly pale and repeatedly checked the corners of the examination room during her visit. This detail was never officially recorded, but emerged in a 1962 interview with Martha Simmons, who had been employed by Dr. Jenkins for over 40 years. 3 weeks later, on May 8th, Louise appeared at the office of Attorney James Pemberton. According to his ledger, she paid him $5 to update her will. The document named no beneficiaries. Instead, it specified that all her possessions should be burned completely, and that no person should enter the second floor of the house under any circumstance. Pemberton later told Sheriff Milligan that he found the request strange, but not concerning enough to question further. A detail that emerged later in Pemberton's personal journal, discovered after his death in 1947, was that Louise had insisted on using her own pen to sign the document. She refused to touch my fountain pen, he wrote, and extracted from her purse a peculiar writing instrument that appeared to be made of bone. This pen was never found among Louise's possessions after her disappearance. Pemberton also noted that Louise wore gloves throughout their meeting despite the mild spring weather, removing only the right one briefly to sign her name. Throughout early summer, Louise Whitaker maintained a quiet presence in Sunbrite. She attended Sunday services at the Presbyterian Church, though Reverend William Gaines noted in his personal journal that Mrs. Whitaker appears increasingly distracted during worship, often looking over her shoulder at the doors and windows. By July, she had stopped attending altogether. Church records contain an interesting note regarding Louise's final attendance on July 6th. The collection plate that day contained an unusual donation attributed to her, a small glass vial sealed with wax. The contents were described as dark powder of unknown origin. Reverend Gaines reportedly disposed of the item, considering it inappropriate for church donation. In his journal, he wrote, "Mrs. Whitaker appeared most insistent that the vial be accepted. When I later informed her it had been discarded, she became visibly distressed, saying only that protection has been refused." The Sunbrite General Store's account book shows that Louise's purchases changed notably during this period. In May, she bought normal household items, coffee, flour, sugar. By late July, her purchases included excessive amounts of kerosene, locks, and, on one occasion, a hammer and nails that the shopkeeper, Thomas Halverson, recalled as being far more substantial than what a woman her size might reasonably need. Halverson's grandson, interviewed in 1958, revealed additional details from his grandfather's recollections. Grandfather said that in June, Mrs. Whitaker began requesting unusual items, salt in large quantities, silver nitrate, and once a small chisel meant for stonework. When he asked what she needed such tools for, she simply replied that she was securing the premises. Grandfather thought she might be reinforcing doors or windows, which wasn't uncommon after the Spanish flu had people fearing outsiders. Perhaps most telling were the letters Louise sent to her sister in Knoxville. These 5 letters, discovered in 1964 in the attic of a home in Knoxville's Old North neighborhood, show a progressive deterioration in Louise's state of mind. The first, dated March 12th, is cheerful and mentions her charming little house with a lovely view of the mountains. By July 24th, her final letter simply states, "It's in the walls now. I hear it moving at night. Don't come looking for me if the letters stop." Some things should stay buried in Sunbrite. The intervening letters tell a disturbing story of gradual isolation. On April 30th, Louise wrote, "I've taken a position keeping the accounts for Mr. Davidson at the lumber mill. The work is straightforward, though I find myself distracted by noises that no one else seems to hear. Last Tuesday, I was certain someone had entered the office behind me, but when I turned, there was no one there. Only a cold spot in the air that seemed to move when I approached it." Her letter of May 22nd mentions, "I've begun researching grandfather's old papers that I found in the attic. His medical techniques were unconventional, but there's wisdom there. He understood that some ailments aren't of the body at all, but come from elsewhere. I've been testing his formulas. The smell is dreadful, but I'm hopeful they might provide some relief from what troubles this house." By June 18th, her correspondence had taken a darker turn. "I no longer leave the house after sunset. Something waits at the edge of the property, watching. I've seen it 3 times now, always in the same spot beneath the old oak tree. It resembles a man in shape, but I know it isn't human. No human could stand so perfectly still for hours. The neighbors don't see it, or pretend not to. I've lined every window with salt, as grandfather's notes suggest, but I fear it's merely a delaying tactic." Her sister, Margaret Collins, apparently did not heed the warning in Louise's final letter. According to a report filed with the Knoxville Police Department on September 3, 1919, Margaret had traveled to Sunbrite after not receiving any correspondence for 5 weeks. What she found, or didn't find, launched what would become Morgan County's most perplexing investigation. Louise Whitaker's house stood intact. There were no signs of forced entry. Her few possessions remained in place. Dishes washed and put away, bed made, clothes hanging in the wardrobe. But of Louise herself, there was no trace. More peculiar was the second floor of the house. According to Margaret's statement, the door to the stairway was secured with 3 separate locks, all on the first floor side. Margaret's full statement, preserved in the archives of the Knoxville Police Department, includes details that were omitted from the official report forwarded to Morgan County. "The house felt wrong," she stated. "The air inside was stale and cold despite the summer heat outside. There was a persistent odor I couldn't identify, somewhat metallic like old pennies. In the kitchen, I found Louise's teacup on the table, still half full, with a thin film across the surface. It looked as though she had simply stood up and walked away in the middle of her morning routine." Margaret also noted something strange about the exterior of the house. All around the foundation, at regular intervals of perhaps 18 inches, small glass vials had been embedded in the soil. Each contained what appeared to be dark soil, mixed with some kind of powder. When I removed one to examine it more closely, I found symbols scratched into the glass that I didn't recognize. When Sheriff Milligan arrived to investigate, he found that the door to the second floor had been reinforced with boards nailed across its frame. It took 2 deputies to force it open. What they found upstairs defies easy explanation and accounts vary slightly between Milligan's official report and what he later told his son in a recorded interview from 1958, just before his death. The second floor consisted of 2 bedrooms and a small sitting area. In the larger bedroom, Louise's personal items were arranged with meticulous precision. Her hairbrush, hand mirror, and Bible were perfectly aligned on a small vanity table. But it was the walls that drew immediate attention. Every inch of wallpaper had been stripped away. In its place, Louise had apparently written thousands of words in what appeared to be a journal or diary, inscribed directly onto the plaster with what testing later revealed to be a mixture of ink and her own blood. The writings covered every available surface: walls, ceiling, even the floor beneath the rug. Most disturbing was the content. It wasn't the raving of a disturbed mind, but rather detailed, methodical observations of what Louise described as movements in the corners of my vision and whispers that come only when I'm alone. She documented times, dates, and locations within the house where these phenomena occurred. The entries became increasingly cramped as she apparently ran out of space, with the final entry dated August 11, 1919. Deputy Frank Morris, who assisted in the investigation, provided additional details in an interview conducted in 1963 for a local historical society project. The writing was impossibly small in places, he recalled. Sheriff Milligan had to use a magnifying glass to read some of it, and the writing wasn't just on the exposed walls. When we moved the furniture, we found more beneath it. It was as if Mrs. Whitaker had written every inch she could reach, even in places no one would normally see. Some of it was in English, but sections appeared to be in Latin or some other language none of us recognized. Morris also described a peculiar feature of the second bedroom, which had apparently been converted into a makeshift laboratory. There was a table set up with dozens of small bottles, measuring instruments, and what looked like chemical equipment. In the center was a large glass container filled with a clear liquid. Suspended in the liquid was something organic, possibly animal tissue of some kind. Sheriff Milligan ordered it removed as evidence, but when the deputy tried to lift it, the glass cracked and the liquid seeped out. The substance inside dissolved almost immediately, leaving nothing to analyze. That final entry in Louise's wall writings, photographed by Milligan, though the photographs were later lost in a courthouse fire in 1942, reportedly read, "It's no longer trying to hide from me. Last night it stood at the foot of my bed from midnight until dawn. It doesn't breathe, it doesn't blink, it only watches. I've sealed myself upstairs now. The locks won't hold, but they might slow it down. I've checked every inch of this floor. There are no hidden entrances, no false walls, and yet it gets in. God forgive me for what I brought back with me." This reference to something brought back puzzled investigators. Louise had arrived in Sunbrite with only 2 trunks, according to the Cincinnati Southern Railway's passenger manifest. One contained clothing and personal items. The other, which was found locked in a closet on the second floor, contained only books, medical texts, journals, and one leather-bound volume with no title. A detailed inventory of the trunk's contents, compiled by Deputy Samuel Garrison, lists several unusual items not mentioned in the official report. One glass jar containing preserved organic matter, labeled Specimen A7, in a handwriting different from Mrs. Whitaker's. One envelope containing what appears to be human hair tied with black thread. One wooden box, approximately 6 inches square, sealed with wax around its lid. The box was never opened as Sheriff Milligan deemed it potential evidence that should remain intact. This unmarked leather-bound book, which became central to the investigation, was described in Milligan's notes as containing anatomical drawings of unusual precision along with writings in what appears to be Latin. The book disappeared from the evidence room 3 days after it was catalogued. Deputy Samuel Garrison, who had been assigned to guard the evidence, claimed he never saw anyone enter or leave the room during his shift. Garrison was found dead in his home 2 months later, an apparent suicide by hanging. The coroner's report, however, noted several inconsistencies. Garrison's feet were clean, despite the muddy floor beneath them. The rope used showed no signs of having supported his weight long enough to cause death. Most puzzling was the expression on Garrison's face, which the coroner described as displaying extreme terror rather than the typical appearance of asphyxiation victims. The case was quickly closed despite these irregularities. Meanwhile, Louise Whitaker remained missing. No body was ever found. No blood evidence suggested foul play, aside from what she had mixed with ink to write on her walls. No one reported seeing her leave town. Her bank account, which contained $212.37, was never accessed again. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Sheriff Milligan began interviewing Louise's neighbors. Eliza Johnson, an elderly woman who lived in the house nearest to Louise's, reported that in late July she had seen Louise speaking with a man at her front gate. Eliza described him as tall, thin, wearing a dark suit despite the summer heat. When pressed for details about his face, Eliza became visibly uncomfortable, according to Milligan's notes. She would only say that he didn't look right in the eyes, and that she had drawn her curtains rather than continue observing them. In an oral history recorded in 1955, Eliza's daughter provided additional context to her mother's statement. "Mother told me things she never told the sheriff. She said the man's face seemed to shift slightly when you weren't looking directly at it. And his shadow, Mother swore his shadow, moved independently of the man, always a fraction of a second too late, as if it had to remember to follow him. After that day, Mother kept a Bible open on her windowsill facing the Whitaker house. 2 other residents reported seeing the same man on different occasions. Thomas Halverson from the general store recalled him buying a single item, a small glass bottle, but couldn't remember what it contained. Most tellingly, Dr. Jenkins admitted that the man had visited his office in early June, claiming to be a colleague from Johns Hopkins University, researching the influenza outbreak. The man had requested access to death records for the county, which Dr. Jenkins had provided. Dr. Jenkins's medical assistant, Martha Simmons, later revealed that the doctor had become fixated on their strange visitor in the weeks following. Dr. Jenkins kept talking about his hands, she recalled in an interview from 1962. He said there was something wrong with them, though he couldn't articulate what. He began washing his own hands compulsively after the visit, sometimes until they bled. He also insisted on removing from his office the chair where the man had sat, claiming it remained cold to the touch for days afterward. By October 1919, the case had stalled. Sheriff Milligan's final report concluded that Louise Whitaker had likely abandoned her home and left the area, though this explanation failed to account for her personal belongings left behind or the disturbing writings on her walls. The house remained empty until 1923, when it was finally sold at auction. The new owners, the Fletcher family, lasted less than a month before leaving abruptly. They refused to discuss their reasons for departing, though neighbors reported hearing the sounds of hammering and construction coming from the house late at night while they lived there. Joseph Fletcher, the youngest son of the family, gave a brief statement to a local newspaper in 1957, breaking nearly 35 years of silence. "We left because the house wouldn't let us stay," he said. "The cold spots would follow you from room to room. Objects moved when no one was looking, but it was the writing that appeared on the walls that finally drove us out. Each morning we'd find new words scratched into the plaster overnight, all with the same message: I'm still here." My father burned his clothes when we left. said he couldn't bear to take anything from that place with us. In 1925, a fire of unknown origin destroyed the house entirely. Nothing was salvaged from the ruins. The land remained vacant until 1940, when the expansion of the railway line required excavation of the property. What workers found during that excavation was documented in a report that was classified and sealed until 1961. According to this report, approximately 6 feet beneath where Louise Whitaker's house had stood, workers uncovered a small cave entrance that did not appear on any geological survey of the area. Inside, they discovered a series of chambers that extended deep into the hillside. In the furthest chamber, workers reported finding a collection of items, several empty glass bottles with unusual residue, a woman's shoe that matched the description of those Louise was known to wear, and, most disturbing, a collection of papers sealed in a metal box. Harold Davis, one of the workers present during the excavation, provided testimony that was excluded from the official report. In a 1959 interview with a local historian, he stated, "That cave wasn't natural. The walls were too smooth, too regular, and there were markings carved everywhere, symbols, letters, in some language I didn't recognize. The air inside was stale but cold, much colder than it should have been. We found a room at the very back that was perfectly circular, with a stone table in the center. That's where we found the box and the other items. None of us wanted to touch anything. It felt wrong, like we were disturbing something that should have stayed buried." These papers, examined by Dr. William Townsend of the University of Tennessee, appeared to be research notes. They detailed experiments involving the extraction and preservation of what the writer referred to as consciousness without form. The notes were signed not by Louise Whitaker, but by Dr. Lawrence Whitaker, a name that appeared in Johns Hopkins University records as a researcher who had been dismissed in 1917 for pursuit of studies deemed unethical and potentially harmful. Dr. Townsend's analysis, submitted to university officials but never published, described the contents in clinical terms. The notes detail a theoretical framework for separating consciousness from its physical vessel, allowing it to exist independently and potentially be transferred to another host. The methodology combines chemical processes with what the author terms sympathetic resonance. Essentially, the idea that consciousness operates on frequencies that can be manipulated under the right conditions. While the premise is scientifically unfounded, the writer's approach is methodical and sophisticated. Most disturbing is the section detailing successful transfers with what appear to be case studies of subjects identified only by initials and dates. The connection between Dr. Lawrence Whitaker and Louise remains unclear. Marriage records from Knoxville confirm that Louise was indeed married to a Lawrence Whitaker who was reported killed in France in 1918. His body was never returned to the United States. Military records indicate he served not in combat, but in a medical unit behind the lines. A letter discovered in 1962 in the archives of the American Expeditionary Forces Medical Corps provides a puzzling detail about Dr. Whitaker's war service. Written by his commanding officer, Colonel James Harrington, to military authorities, it states, "Dr. Whitaker's behavior has become increasingly erratic. He has abandoned his assigned duties to pursue personal research using military resources. Most concerning are reports that he has been collecting tissue samples from deceased soldiers without authorization. When confronted, he claimed to be developing a new preservation technique that would allow the essence of a person to persist after bodily death. I recommend his immediate recall and psychological evaluation." The letter is dated October 12, 1918, 1 week before Dr. Whitaker was reportedly killed in a German artillery barrage. The most troubling revelation came in 1963, when Margaret Collins, Louise's sister, finally agreed to be interviewed by a historical researcher from the University of Tennessee. Now elderly and in failing health, Margaret revealed that the house in Sunbrite had not been randomly selected by her sister. According to family lore, it had been built in the 1880s by their maternal grandfather. a man rumored to practice medicine of a questionable nature. The house had remained in the family but unoccupied for decades before Louise took up residence there. Lawrence was obsessed with our grandfather's work, Margaret stated in the recorded interview. He found journals, formulas, things no God-fearing person should know about. After they told me he died in France, Louise changed. She wouldn't speak of him, wouldn't even have his name mentioned. Then one day she announced she was moving to Sunbrite, to grandfather's old house. She said she had work to continue. Those were her exact words. Margaret's full testimony included details about her grandfather, Dr. Elias Thornton, who had practiced medicine in Tennessee from 1860 until his mysterious disappearance in 1891. Grandfather didn't believe death was final, she explained. He thought it was a barrier that could be overcome through science. The family tried to distance themselves from his work after he vanished, but Lawrence found his papers hidden in our mother's attic. He and Louise would spend hours poring over them. I remember walking in once to find them mixing chemicals, following formulas from grandfather's notes. Lawrence called it opening the door between states of being. Louise looked frightened, but she never tried to stop him. The researcher asked if Margaret believed her sister had met with foul play. Her response, captured on the aging tape, is perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire case. Louise isn't dead. That's what frightens me most. The last time I saw her house, I looked up at the second-floor window before I went to the door. She was there, watching me. But when I went inside and upstairs, there was no one there. Just those horrible writings on the wall. Louise found what Lawrence was looking for. And now, I don't think she's a person anymore. Margaret elaborated further, though this portion of the interview was deemed too distressing by the researcher to include in his official report. When I saw her in the window, something was wrong with her eyes. They were empty somehow, and her movements weren't right. Too fluid, like she wasn't accustomed to having a body. I called her name from the street, and she smiled at me. That smile? It was too wide, too fixed. No human face should be able to smile like that. I should have run then, but she was my sister. I had to know what happened to her. By the time I got upstairs, the room was empty, but the air was cold, and I could smell something like ozone. On the vanity table was a note in Louise's handwriting that said only, "Margaret, go home. I'm learning to exist differently now." Margaret Collins died 2 weeks after this interview. The tape was filed away in the university archives and forgotten until 1968, when a graduate student stumbled upon it while researching the influenza epidemic's impact on rural Tennessee. The student David Latimer became fascinated by the case and sought out additional sources of information. In the process, he discovered hospital records indicating that Margaret Collins had been admitted to the University of Tennessee Medical Center the day after her interview, suffering from what doctors diagnosed as extreme hypothermia. The medical report noted, patient's core temperature on admission was 92.4 degrees, despite ambient temperatures in the 70s. Patient reports feeling a cold that started inside and worked outward after her research interview. Of note, patient exhibits unusual bruising on her right hand in a pattern that resembles finger marks, though she lives alone and denies any physical contact with others in the preceding 24 hours. In the decades since, the story of Louise Whitaker has been largely forgotten. The land where her house stood is now part of the railway yard in what remains of Sunbrite. No marker indicates the significance of the location. County records from that period are spotty at best, with many having been destroyed in the 1942 courthouse fire. A railway employee named Robert Jenkins, who worked as a night watchman from 1950 to 1968, kept a log of unusual occurrences at the site. His entries, discovered after his retirement, document dozens of instances of what he termed the cold woman. According to Jenkins, she appears most often in January and August, always after midnight, always near where the old house foundation used to be. She stands perfectly still, sometimes for hours. I've approached her twice. The first time in 1953, she vanished as I got within 20 feet. The second time, in 1961, She turned to look at me. I won't make that mistake again. Her face isn't right. It looks unfinished somehow, like something wearing a mask that doesn't quite fit. What remains are questions without satisfactory answers. Who was the man seen visiting Louise in the weeks before her disappearance? What was the nature of Dr. Lawrence Whitaker's research, and did Louise continue it after his reported death? What did she believe she had brought back with her to the house in Sunbrite? Perhaps most disturbing is the series of missing persons reports filed in Morgan County between 1919 and 1925. 14 people, travelers mostly, disappeared while passing through the area. None were ever found. The report stopped after the fire that destroyed Louise's house. A 1967 analysis of these disappearances, conducted by criminologist Dr. Alan Barrett of Vanderbilt University, revealed a pattern previously unnoticed. All 14 missing persons were last seen within a 1-mile radius of the Whitaker property. Each disappearance occurred on either the first or last quarter moon. Most tellingly, in 7 of the 14 cases, witnesses reported seeing the missing person in conversation with a slender woman in outdated clothing shortly before they vanished. One witness, a train conductor named George Miller, provided a detailed description of this woman that matches Louise Whitaker's appearance, despite the fact that Miller had arrived in Sunbrite 2 years after her disappearance and could not have known her. The only physical evidence that remains of the entire affair is a single page from Louise's wall writings, which Sheriff Milligan had removed and kept in his personal possession until his death. His son donated it to the Tennessee State Archives in 1960, where it remains today, though access is restricted. The text, photographed once before being sealed in preservation materials, contains a passage that has never been fully explained. It wears his face now when it wants to, perfect in every detail, except for the eyes. The eyes are wrong because they're empty. It comes and goes as it pleases, moving through spaces that shouldn't exist. I've seen others in town that have the same empty eyes now. It's spreading. I sealed the entrance in the cellar, but that won't hold. Nothing holds. I should have burned this place to the ground the moment I realized what he'd done. Now it's too late. It's in me, too. The complete text of this preserved page includes additional information, not widely reported. August 9th, 1919. I can feel it trying to take hold inside me. My thoughts aren't entirely my own anymore. I find myself standing in rooms with no memory of how I got there. Last night, I woke to find myself in the cellar, standing before the sealed door. My hands were bloody from trying to claw through the bricks. It wants to open the way completely. I've mixed grandfather's formula as a last resort, the one he claimed could bind an untethered consciousness. The taste is bitter, and it burns going down, but I can feel it working. My thoughts are clearer now. I know what I have to do. Lawrence isn't dead. He found a way to come back, but not as himself. Not entirely. What returned is something composite. Part Lawrence, part something else that was waiting on the other side. I have to finish what I've started. In 1967, a historian researching the case attempted to locate the cave system reportedly found beneath the property. County surveys showed no such geological feature. When excavation equipment was brought to the site, workers reported equipment failures and unusual compass deviations. The project was abandoned after a worker suffered an unexplained seizure while operating a digging machine. James Wilson, the worker who experienced the seizure, later gave a statement to the historian that was never published. When the drill bit broke through, I felt something rush past me. Like a wind, but cold, colder than anything I've ever felt. Then there was a pressure in my head, like something was trying to get in. I fought against it. That's the last thing I remember before waking up in the hospital. The doctors called it a seizure, but I know what a seizure is. This was something trying to take me over. I quit the job that same day. Some things should stay buried. The cave entrance was hastily resealed with concrete. In 1968, railway records indicate that the entire area was paved over during an expansion of the freight yard. No further attempts to excavate the site have been made. The case of Louise Whitaker officially remains unsolved. It appears in no textbooks, no official histories of the region. The records that do exist are scattered across archives, personal collections, and courthouse basements. Most people living in Sunbrite today have never heard her name. Yet something about the case persists in local memory. Residents still avoid building on the land where her house once stood. Railway workers report unusual cold spots near the site, even in summer. And occasionally, usually during the quiet hours before dawn, the night watchman at the railway yard reports seeing a solitary figure standing motionless at the edge of the property. A thin woman in outdated clothes, watching the trains as they pass. A security guard employed by the railway company in the early 1960s, William Parker, kept a personal journal documenting his experiences. An entry from August 1963 reads, "Saw her again last night, standing in the same spot as always. This time, I decided to record her with the camera I brought. The photograph developed, but where she stood, there's just a blur." The strangest thing, though, is what appears to be standing behind her. A tall, thin shape that wasn't visible to my naked eye. Whatever it is, it seems to be leaning over her shoulder, like it's whispering to her, "I won't be bringing the camera again. Some things you're better off not seeing clearly." Is this merely local folklore that has attached itself to a century-old missing persons case? Perhaps. But those familiar with the complete history of Louise Whitaker might wonder about the last entry in Sheriff Milligan's personal journal, written the night before he died in 1958. "I never told anyone what I saw that night in September 1919 when I returned alone to the Whitaker house to collect the last of the evidence. I was upstairs removing the final section of wall writing when I heard footsteps on the stairs. I called out thinking it was one of my deputies. No one answered. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate. When I turned, Louise Whitaker was standing in the doorway. She looked exactly as described in the missing persons report, except for her eyes. They were wrong somehow, empty. She said nothing, just watched me. I ran past her, down the stairs, and out of that house. I never went back. I've told myself for years it was just exhaustion, a trick of the light. But now that my own time is short, I need to write the truth. Whatever was wearing Louise Whitaker's face that night wasn't her. And I fear it's still out there, still watching. The journal contains one final hastily scrawled note, dated the morning of Milligan's death. "Cold in the room this morning. Breath visible despite summer heat. Something standing in the corner. Won't look directly at it. If found, tell my son to burn the Whitaker page. It's how it tracks. Morgan County has changed much in the century since Louise Whitaker disappeared. The railroad remains, but many of the small towns it once served have dwindled. Sunbrite persists, though few of its current residents can trace their lineage there beyond a generation or two. In 1964, during renovation of the Presbyterian Church, workers discovered a sealed compartment beneath the pulpit. Inside was a single envelope addressed to whoever seeks the truth about Louise. The letter inside, written by Reverend William Gaines shortly before his death in 1931, contained a confession of sorts. I knew what Lawrence Whitaker was researching before he went to war. He consulted me about ancient texts, believing I might have theological insights. The things he sought knowledge about were blasphemous. When Louise came to Sunbrite, I recognized her from the photograph Lawrence had shown me years before. But I said nothing, did nothing. I convinced myself it was not my place to interfere. May God forgive me for my silence. The thing that wore Louise's face came to my church for months. It sat among my congregation. It took communion from my hands. And all the while, its eyes, those terrible, empty eyes. After it stopped attending services, others in town began to change as well. Their movements became different. Their speech patterns altered slightly. Always the eyes gave them away. I've sealed this account away in hopes that someday someone might understand what happened here and prevent it from spreading further. I believe the fire in 1925 may have contained it, but I cannot be certain. Watch for the eyes. Always the eyes. The letter included a detail not shared with university researchers, a small diagram showing the layout of the Whitaker House Foundation with a specific spot marked with an X and the notation, "The door is here, sealed with brick and mortar, but still a door. It must never be opened again." The letter was examined by University of Tennessee psychologists, who concluded it was likely the product of elderly dementia or perhaps religious mania. It was filed away and forgotten until 1968, when it was rediscovered by the same graduate student who found Margaret Collins's recorded interview. David Latimer, the graduate student who assembled much of the modern research on the case, vanished in October 1968. His apartment was found undisturbed, with half-finished notes on the Whitaker case spread across his desk. The final entry in his research journal reads, "Meeting a woman tonight who claims to have information about Louise Whitaker's grandfather, says she has his original research notes. Agreed to meet at the old railway station in Sunbrite. Will update tomorrow." Latimer's disappearance was investigated by local authorities, but no leads were ever developed. His research materials were boxed and stored in the university archives. According to archive records, the box was checked out in 1969 by a woman claiming to be from the Historical Society. The materials were never returned, and when university officials contacted the Historical Society, they had no record of requesting the items. Perhaps the final word on the case comes from an unexpected source. In 1969, a manuscript was discovered in the possession of Thomas Halverson's grandson. It appeared to be a memoir written by Halverson in the 1950s but never published. Most of the content concerned ordinary matters, the running of his store, weather patterns, local gossip. But one passage, dated September 1919, stands out. "I know what happened to the Whitaker woman. Everyone in town does, but no one will speak of it. The man who came to my store wasn't a man at all. I knew it the moment I saw him. He bought a bottle of iodine, but his hand passed through mine when I gave him his change. I felt a coldness, like nothing I've ever experienced. That night I took my shotgun and went to the Whitaker house. I meant to warn her, to help her if I could. I saw them through the window, Louise and the thing wearing a man's shape. They were standing in her parlor, facing each other. Then, as I watched, they both simply faded, like smoke dispersing. I fired my shotgun into the air out of pure terror, then ran home and locked my doors. I told the sheriff I'd heard a noise and investigated, but found nothing. I lied. God help me, I lied. And now, all these years later, I still see them sometimes, walking through town as if they belong here, wearing faces I recognize, but the eyes are always wrong, always empty." Halverson's memoir continues with a detailed accounting of changes he noticed in Sunbrite following Louise's disappearance. It started with Dr. Jenkins. About a week after the sheriff's investigation began, the doctor's manner changed. His movements became stiff, mechanical. His voice, once warm and friendly, turned monotone. But most noticeable was how he would stand perfectly still when he thought no one was watching him. I saw him once through my store window, standing in the middle of the street for nearly 20 minutes, not moving a muscle, not even appearing to breathe. When someone approached, he suddenly animated, as if a switch had been flipped. Halverson's account names 7 other residents who exhibited similar changes between September 1919 and the fire that destroyed the Whitaker house in 1925. All 7 individuals left Sunbrite abruptly in the months following the fire. Records indicate that none of them were ever documented as residing anywhere else afterward. Halverson's manuscript was dismissed as fiction by his family. It remains in private hands, unavailable for scholarly examination. His grandson, interviewed briefly in 1967, stated, "Grandfather became obsessed with the Whitaker case in his later years. The family considered it a harmless eccentricity of old age. He would sit by the window for hours, watching people pass by on the street. Sometimes he'd suddenly close the curtains and refuse to leave the house for days. When asked why, he would only say, 'One of them walked by.'" And so the case of Louise Whitaker remains open, a footnote in Tennessee history known only to a few researchers and local history enthusiasts. The house is gone. The records are fragmentary. The witnesses have all passed away. All that remains is a story, one that cannot be proven or disproven after the passage of a century. In 1966, a doctoral candidate named Elizabeth Morrow conducted research into the psychological impact of industrial development on rural communities in eastern Tennessee. During interviews with elderly residents of Morgan County, she recorded several accounts of what locals called the empty people, individuals who supposedly lived in the area in the 1920s, who looked normal but weren't right inside. Morrow attributed these stories to cultural resistance to outsiders during the period, particularly those associated with northern industrial interests. Her dissertation makes no mention of Louise Whitaker or the strange occurrences in Sunbrite, as she was apparently unaware of the case. One interview subject, identified only as male 81, lifetime resident, told Morrow, "You could always tell them by how they moved. Too perfect. Like they'd studied how people walk and talk but hadn't quite mastered it. They didn't blink enough, and they were always cold to the touch, even in summer. We knew to stay clear of them, especially after dark. They started appearing right after that woman disappeared, the one who lived in the old house by the tracks. By the time I was a boy, most of them had gone, but my pa taught me to recognize the signs just in case. Is it merely a tale that grew in the telling? A missing person case embellished over generations? Or is there something more to the disappearance of a widow in a small Tennessee town in 1919? One final note. In 1965, renovations to the Johns Hopkins University Medical Archives uncovered a sealed file on Dr. Lawrence Whitaker. Most of the contents were administrative, his hiring, research proposals, and eventual dismissal. But attached to his personnel file was a photograph, presumably of Dr. Whitaker himself. University officials were puzzled to find that the photograph had deteriorated in a peculiar way. The face was clearly visible, the clothing intact, but where the eyes should have been, there were only empty spaces, as if that portion of the photographic emulsion had simply disappeared. The archivist who discovered the file, Marion Phillips, included a note describing her experience. Upon finding the photograph in this condition, I assumed it had been vandalized or damaged by improper storage. However, when I returned the following day with a conservation specialist, we discovered that the deterioration had spread. The entire face was now obscured, and a cold spot had developed around the file itself. My colleague reported feeling lightheaded and experiencing visual disturbances while handling the materials. As a precautionary measure, we resealed the file in an acid-free container and returned it to storage. The file was resealed and returned to storage. When researchers attempted to access it again in 1968, it could not be located. According to archive records, it had never existed at all. A nighttime security guard at the university library, Edward Clements, filed an unusual incident report in October 1968, just days after the Whitaker file reportedly went missing. He claimed to have seen a woman in outdated clothing entering the archives after hours. When he confronted her, she turned to him and smiled but said nothing. Clements reported, "Her face wasn't right. It looked like it didn't fit her properly, like a mask that's too loose. And her eyes, I can't explain what was wrong with them except that looking into them was like looking into empty space." When he checked the archives, he found no one there, though a cabinet that should have been locked stood open, with files scattered on the floor. In the quiet hills of eastern Tennessee, the trains still run through Sunbrite. At night, when the moon is hidden and the stars provide the only light, the railway yard sits in darkness. And sometimes, according to those who work the night shift, a woman in outdated clothes can be seen standing at the edge of the property, watching, always watching. But no one approaches her, no one calls out, because even from a distance they can tell that something about her eyes isn't right. A series of unusual incidents reported by railway employees between 1950 and 1969 includes accounts of unexplained mechanical failures whenever trains passed the specific section of track nearest to where the Whitaker house once stood. In at least 17 documented cases, trains experienced simultaneous failure of electrical systems while passing the site. Engineers reported sudden drops in temperature inside the locomotive cabs. 3 separate engineers claimed to have seen a woman standing on the tracks, only to have her vanish as the train approached. The most detailed account comes from engineer Howard Lawson, who filed a formal report in 1962. As we approached the Sunbrite yard, I observed a female figure in white standing directly on the tracks approximately 200 yards ahead. I immediately initiated emergency braking procedures and sounded the horn repeatedly. The figure remained motionless. As we closed the distance, I could see it was a woman in an old-fashioned dress. She turned her head to look directly at the train, and I observed that her face appeared incorrect somehow. The train should have struck her, but at the moment of impact, she simply vanished. The temperature in the cab dropped so severely that frost formed on the windows despite it being August. The electrical systems failed completely, and we rolled to a stop approximately half a mile past the sighting location. Upon inspection, no mechanical cause for the electrical failure could be determined. Following this incident, railway management quietly instituted a policy requiring trains to maintain maximum speed while passing through the Sunbrite yard, with no scheduled stops between sunset and sunrise. This policy remained in effect until 1975, when new management dismissed it as baseless superstition. In 1967, the Tennessee State Archives received an unusual donation from a woman claiming to be a distant relative of Louise Whitaker. The items included a small wooden box sealed with wax, accompanied by a note instructing that it should remain unopened and stored alongside the preserved page from Louise's wall writings. Archive staff noted that the handwriting on the note bore a striking resemblance to Louise's known handwriting, despite the donation occurring nearly 50 years after her disappearance. The woman who delivered the items was not asked for identification and was described only as elderly, well-dressed, and soft-spoken. When archivists later attempted to examine the box, they discovered that the wax seal bore unusual markings similar to those described on the vials found buried around the Whitaker House Foundation. A decision was made to honor the instructions and leave the box sealed. It remains in the archives to this day, cataloged simply as Artifact 7219B, related to Whitaker case, not for public access. Today, the story of Louise Whitaker exists primarily as a whispered tale among those who study the stranger corners of Tennessee's history. Occasionally, amateur investigators attempt to piece together the fragments of the case, but key records remain missing, witnesses are long dead, and the site itself has been transformed by decades of industrial development, and yet reports persist. Every few years, someone claims to have seen a woman in outdated clothes standing near the railway tracks in Sunbrite. Always at night, always alone, always watching with eyes that don't seem quite human. In 2003, during installation of a new section of track, workers uncovered what appeared to be a small glass vial embedded in the soil. Inside was a dark powder and a single human tooth. According to the project foreman, the vial was reburied at the instruction of management, who wanted no delays to the construction schedule. By the next morning, the exact location had been paved over. Is the story of Louise Whitaker merely an elaborate tale spun from the disappearance of a war widow in a remote Tennessee town? Or does it point to something darker, something that exists in the shadows of our understanding? Perhaps the only certainty is that in Sunbrite, Tennessee, when the night train passes, the engineers never slow down, and they never ever look too closely at the figures that might be standing along the tracks. Because some stories should remain just that, stories, and some truths are better left buried in the hills of eastern Tennessee.